How to Test This, the podcast designed to help software testers understand risk and adopt new testing solutions with ease and confidence. Your host is Mahamadou, a quality assurance consultant with over 10 years of experience across multiple industries. In each episode, he'll talk to different experts and learn from them about how they test.
Hi, everyone. Today, I'm happy to welcome Ben Fellows. For those who don't know him, Ben is a founder and CEO of LoopQA. They provide expert testers to startups and large companies. He is behind the augmented coding concept and is also an industry leader recognized for the blogging, articles on social media, and workshops. He believes that AI is a powerful assistant for testers, not a replacement. He is a strong advocate for augmented coding with tools like Playwright and Cursor, and is also passionate about developing the next generation of QA leads. So welcome, Ben.
Happy to be here.
Great. So in this episode, we'll be mainly talking about augmented coding. We'll start with your journey into testing and creating LoopQA. Then we'll define what augmented coding means and why it matters for QA. After that, we'll talk about how to make software testing better, and also how to implement augmented coding in our day-to-day. And finally, we conclude with the future of software testing and career advice. So without further ado, we can get started. Can you walk us through your journey into testing and how you decided to make a living out of it?
Yeah. So like a lot of people, particularly in the States, my journey was very accidental to get into QA. What's interesting about QA in the States is that there's no real good feeder system for it as a profession. There's no four-year college degree. And so most people who are in QA over here are going to be people who, largely speaking, got into it pretty much accidentally. I had a career actually in politics before tech. I was working in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and then had the opportunity to join a tech startup knowing nothing about tech. Did that for 4 or 5 years. And basically we had death by 1,000 cuts, which is sort of largely a term where anytime you release, some little thing would go wrong. Very rarely would you take down the whole app, but I got to see firsthand how challenging QA is to do on a complex app with a lot of different combinations of things that you can do in it. We tried to hire a variety of QA people, tried to outsource QA people, and through the whole time felt very much like, there was this gap that I was seeing in the industry. And so after that, company decided, QA was something that I wanted to focus on. And I've spent the last 8 years doing primarily, just QA for a whole variety of different companies.
Okay, can you talk about that, the death by 1,000 cuts that inspired you to create LoopQA?
Yeah. So to me, what I always say is like, at its core, QA is a technical solution solving an emotional problem. So at like what quality actually is the trust between software and its customer, right? This idea that the software will perform as the user expects. It represents trust. The customer has made a leap of faith for using a piece of software. They have either invested money or time or both oftentimes for using that software. And so what the software needs to do is it needs to perform as the user would expect. And that goes beyond just like functional bugs, right? It's not just 500 errors, but it's also workflows and UX, UI, and a whole variety of things. And so at its core, QA's job is basically to provide a technical solution to solve this emotional problem, right? So when you push a software bug into production, you are damaging the trust between the customer and the product, right? And so at its core, what I talk about and why I watch this is, death by 1,000 cuts. It's not just something that affects like the backlog. It affects the emotional well-being of the team. It affects the psyche. It affects the customers, and it's the worst customers are not the ones that are angry. They're the ones that are disappointed, right? Hey, I put my trust into you and you've repeatedly sort of, for whatever reason, let me down, right? And so what you can kind of see happen, particularly in companies that maybe have struggled with QA for long periods of time, is just truly this emotional impact that permeates between customers, the internal team, and the process and so forth. And so, that's kind of where death by 1,000 cuts for me kind of inspired that journey.
And what makes it different from other companies? Because there's many companies out there.
Yeah. So my company specifically, at its core, I'm not going to claim that I have discovered some magic thing that other people can't discover, right? So what I focus on is 3 core traits: emotional intelligence, critical thinking, analytical ability, and ambition. And I focus on hiring engineers who have those 3 traits, right? Terminology and methodology is very much in my mind a given. You have to understand the terminology and methodology, but these 3 traits: critical thinking, analytical ability, emotional intelligence, and ambition, QA is oftentimes at the center of an organization in many ways. As much as it feels like the black sheep, it's the people who are talking to customer service, they're talking to devs, they're talking to product people. They sit in sort of this glue. And so what I focus on is not just can you do testing, but there's a ton of soft skills that go with QA that surround it. And then there's also the ambition component, which is when you have an industry with a lot of people who kind of got into it accidentally, a lot of people don't understand what their career path should or can be. And so what I would say that we have focused on is that as a process. If there is anything that makes us unique per se, I'd say our hiring process is something that we've dialed in really, really well, down to borderline, I would say, a proprietary system where we do a lot of live pair programming as part of the hiring cycle. We have a very systematic way of identifying who we think is the right fit and the wrong fit. And ultimately, that's probably our value prop, along with the people, is really just we understand how to hire AI-empowered engineers, and that's what we're focusing on.
Okay. And is there benefits of having a team being onshore rather than offshore?
I think there's talent everywhere in the world. I think that if you're based in the States and working with a team in the States, obviously there's just the component of like being within the same country has benefits from a communication perspective, somewhat of a cultural perspective, sometimes even a security perspective, in terms of like some of our clients just literally are not allowed to have like data leave the States, stuff like that. I think that there is absolutely talent everywhere in the world. I think that the farther you go from where you're based, the harder it is to kind of sift through good talent versus bad talent. So when it comes to like working inshore versus onshore, or onshore versus offshore, whatever country you're in, I just think that you're probably better suited to choose the right partner when you're within the country that you're working with. But I would also say that I've worked with many offshore folks that are unbelievably good. And so if you can find the right partner, like there's nothing wrong with that route. I just tend to work with folks within the same country that I'm in.
And when companies contacting you, what pain are they experiencing?
It sort of falls down into 4 kind of core buckets, right? And none of them are particularly, I think, unique. You will have sort of less bugs in prod, which is your most stereotypical one, right? They have bugs making it into prod and they want less of them. You have QA bottlenecks or throughput, and they want to figure out, well, how can QA be, less of a quote unquote bottleneck, which is a weird one. And there's a lot of misconceptions in that. You have cost, which is people saying, well, this costs too much, right? For better or worse, QA is oftentimes looked at as a cost center to be minimized as opposed to something to be invested in to generate new revenue. And so people might want to minimize cost. And then the fourth is scaling. So companies will sometimes come to us saying, hey, we have 1 or 2 QA people, but we don't understand how to hire out a team, right? And so generally speaking, what we're doing is trying to focus on like, what's the one metric that we can impact, and then really locking in on that metric. You'd be surprised the number of companies who they know they have a QA problem, but they're not tracking QA metrics. And so they don't really have a sense of how to measure what success is. And so I would say what we're focusing on is, okay, which of those buckets do you want to fall into, and which metrics can we measure to look at impact in there?
Okay. And dealing with them, what is the biggest misconceptions they have towards software testing?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconceptions for many companies is that they think it's an automation problem when it's actually a process problem. So a lot of companies think, oh, if we have test automation, that'll solve our quality, right? And test automation is like super important, and it can be unbelievably useful. And in the world of AI, test automation is more approachable than ever before. But if you have a bad process, or if you have bad things upstream, like even just developers and development, no matter what you do from an automation perspective, you're not going to solve your QA problems. And so I think the biggest misconception is that people want to hire a QA engineer to solve like quality, when quality is a whole process, starting from, are the product requirements well defined, and all the acceptance criteria? Are there the right meetings? Do developers actually care about quality and doing their own testing in some capacity? What unit tests and integration tests exist? Like the whole gamut, instead of just like, hey, let's buy an automation engineer and use AI and quality is fixed. So that's something that we work a lot with organizations on. It's like, great, you're going to bring on an automation engineer, but that's the first sort of step in this journey if you want quality to be addressed.
Okay. And I also heard you're a big fan of tools such as a Playwright and Cursors. What make them so special?
Yeah, I think that tools are an interesting conversation. So I've used Playwright, I've used Cypress, I've used Selenium. I am a Playwright ambassador, so technically, like, I probably use Playwright more than the other ones, but any one of those front-end frameworks works. I've used Cursor, Codex, Claude Code, all of the sort of AI tools as well. To me, I think that where I would sort of rank the most important tools, I think the most important thing that you can do right now in terms of tools is focus on the right models, which is like you can use Cursor, but if you're using a bad model, you're not going to have good results. You can use Claude Code. If you're using a bad model, you're not going to have good results. And then when it comes to like the actual automation frameworks, Playwright is great. I enjoy it. It's very simple to use, but kind of equally speaking, Playwright, there's a lot of bad practices you can do with Playwright that make it really ineffective. And so one of the things I talk a lot about is high leverage activities versus low leverage activities. And within Playwright, for example, if you're doing Playwright automation, sure, you might choose a framework that I like and support, but if you're doing a bunch of low leverage activities within that as a framework, you're still not going to have, the success that maybe you see on the internet.
Yeah, I got it. So thank you. Now we know about you. Let's talk about the augmented coding solution. In simple terms, can you define what that is and how it's important to adopt?
So I define augmented coding as basically the idea of using AI to help you code, right? So if you look at this as a spectrum, on one hand, there is no AI for coding, and that's just like handwriting your own stuff, right? On the other end of the spectrum is what you might call agentic development, meaning like you set an agent in some agentic factory or pipeline or whatever, and then you come back when you wake up the next morning and the software has kind of magically been built. And then augmented coding is kind of sits in the middle, which is a human driving the code and trying to figure out kind of what the outcome actually is going to be. And so, other people might call it vibe coding. I think vibe coding is something that largely is used as a derogatory. Vibe coding is used in a way that's trying to like push down people who are using AI and like not serious. And augmented coding to me is the idea that like you're writing the same code that otherwise you would write by hand. You're just producing it a lot faster. And so to me, that's what I kind of define as augmented coding.
And you mentioned vibe coding. So is it totally different from vibe coding?
Not necessarily. I mean, to me, I think vibe coding, everyone uses it in somewhat different ways. The idea, I think, when a developer sort of says, oh, vibe coding is bad, I think that what it comes down to is the idea is the AI driving you or are you driving the AI? So I think that when people think about vibe coding, they think about coding with AI in a way that the person doing it doesn't necessarily know architecture practices, best practices, security, performance, all of these different things. And so they're just kind of developing. And there's this perception, I think, that, oh, you might get some MVP built, but you're never going to be able to build like real software. I genuinely think that that's a whole different, really fascinating conversation, because if a founder can quote unquote vibe code an app to a point where then they can sell it, like, doesn't matter, because it's like they'll get a certain revenue point and then sure, they can bring on engineers and stuff like that. And so to me, the idea is, I call it augmented coding just because I think I tend to want to not have to fight the fight of like, oh, vibe coding. And the only difference I would say maybe is augmented coding is using AI with purpose, where you're driving the AI as opposed to the AI driving you. But I also think that a lot of people who try to look down on this stuff are not actually doing it from a purely technical perspective. They're trying to, out of fear of AI like replacing them, try to basically call people using it names and like vibe coders and not serious or whatever. But different conversation probably in some ways.
Okay, and does it also include like agentic or MCP-driven coding?
Yeah. So I think that like what's interesting about coding with AI that a lot of people do not, I think, give credit for is it's a skill in itself. So like you can learn Playwright, right? And that is a skill. You've learned the framework, you understand, how to do the different locators, stuff like that. Developing with AI is absolutely a skill that like you have to spend a ton of time and energy doing, because it is something that you start to develop habits in, you start to figure out what are the things that normally go wrong, go right, stuff like that. Having spent thousands of hours developing with AI, I'm always struck when I work with someone for the first time how I'm using the same kind of tool set, and yet I'm able to produce a lot more effectively with it. And I've kind of come to that conclusion, which is like it is almost the same as learning a framework, which is so different, right? Because like VS Code as a tool, right? Like you could come up to speed on VS Code fairly quickly as a tool. Now, you might not know every plugin or every tool that someone who's been using it for 10 years might use, but when it comes to like augmented coding, that's not going to be the same. Like I think you probably have to spend at least a couple hundred hours doing this before you're ever going to become like truly like highly competent with AI tools and sort of understanding how to use them. In regards to the MCP stuff, I'm not a huge fan of MCPs. I tend to rely on tools that expose COIs more than like MCPs, which is a slightly different approach. And then I tend to not really use like agentic and instead focus on code-based solutions. So where someone might use an MCP Playwright server to like go look at a web app and try to rip the HTML, I'm a big fan of just use a model to go look at the code itself and pull the locators there. So definitely do use MCPs, but kind of time and place.
Okay, so you said you've been doing testing for 8 years. Do you have an example of a project when you had a clear, measurable success on ROI also? On what changed after the implementation?
Yeah, so a lot of my projects I can't talk about because the clients just have NDA, so I'll talk about kind of a personal project. I think that there's kind of two eras that I would say I've lived in, right? There's the pre-AI era and then there's the post-AI era, right? And those are very, very, very different things. When it comes to the post-AI era, I'll compare kind of the measurable success against the pre-AI era because I've done a lot of these measurements. So if you think about automation, right, you just black box automation where you have like your UX UI and then you have your API stuff, right? A page object model, which has all your locators, your methods, whatever, that traditionally might take you somewhere in the range of like 4 to 6 hours to do by hand with no AI, right? Where you're basically, opening the browser, you're right clicking, grabbing the locators, so forth, writing your own locators and so forth. And that took 4 to 6 hours, let's say. That now with AI can take around 8 minutes and be just as effective in terms of like grab all the HTML, it writes all the locators, even faster if you're allowed to add test IDs. So the sort of measurable results really come down to not introducing some like magic new form of coverage, but the compression of the time and effort that it goes in to do the same thing. So whereas it used to take me, let's say, a couple weeks to get a Smoke and Sanity Suite coverage from my page object perspective, I can now do that in a morning. And that translates to catching a lot more things a lot quicker. So similarly at the API level, I had an afternoon where I added around 400 API tests and I caught 13 bugs in a project that I would not have caught. And this is a really interesting argument in the world of QA because there's a lot of QA people who would say, well, you can't possibly know what those 400 tests are all covering. And the answer that I would have to that is I agree. I didn't that afternoon know every detail of those 400 tests, but I started that afternoon with 0 test coverage on the API, and I ended that afternoon with 400, and I found 13 issues that were fixed within the next 2 hours. And then I spent the next few days going through all those API tests and making sure that they actually were exactly what I wanted. And so to me, it's unbelievable the compression of time and effort it takes to produce results.
So you said when you have with the free time, you check more the test. What else do you invest your free time on after you saved so many hours of work?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I more and more tend to couple test automation with development. So what I mean by that is, when I'm in my own time doing projects and stuff like that, I'm doing a lot of my own development And so what I'm finding as I'm doing test automation with that is that I'm doing stuff like adding test IDs directly into the HTML code. I'm adding unit tests and integration tests. I'm constantly trying to think about the test pyramid and efficiency. And so what I spend the most time on right now these days is thinking about the test pyramid and thinking about, am I over relying on the wrong kind of tests? So what I'm constantly trying to do is look at, okay, I have these workflow tests that are the end-to-end tests. What can I eliminate in order to push down into the cycle? You'll see if you follow me on LinkedIn that I tend to post a lot these days about unit tests and integration tests. And what I find in the world of QA is that there is a tremendous misunderstanding in many cases about the role and value of unit tests. There's a lot of QA engineers who think it's only a developer tool, right? And they almost assign unit tests as this like thing that just verifies the output as a string or something. Like there's no business logic. When I do development, the vast majority of my business logic or my QA tests are unit tests, because that's where all the business logic lives, is in this stuff. And so when it comes to like the free time that has been created by the AI and test automation, it's really thinking about strategy and architecture and looking for gaps and efficiencies. Yeah, once again, a couple of different thoughts in there, but that's kind of where my time goes.
You add ID, you focus on unit test. So does it mean that, and also you talk about architecture. So does it mean the role of tester should evolve in a different way? Because usually as a tester, we don't have access to the code base. So even if something, I ask either the architect or the developer directly.
Yeah. So what I would say is the answer to that in my mind is absolutely. And so this is where you get into like theory versus pragmatic reality, right? So right now, there's this huge tension point in the world of QA around like developers are using AI to move faster and faster. So how does QA catch up, right? How does QA keep up? And the only answer I can possibly come up with is basically, if your developers are using AI to produce code, the only way to get effective test coverage is to use AI to produce test automation code. It is not to use AI to agentically go through a browser and try to do this or that, or to do anything. It's, to me, unfortunately, I think QA is going to become more and more an engineering code-based role, because you can produce so much coverage through the code. The benefit of that is I think that technical QA people are better suited than anyone else right now to be tremendously valuable to their organizations, because they sit between a product person who basically doesn't understand code and then a developer who's writing the code, and they're able to translate all of those tests into highly effective automated tests, both at the Playwright level, at the unit and integration level, and so forth. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of organizations who are currently setting their QA teams up for failure. And one of the things I talk a lot about is that, where they're basically saying to their QA team, hey, guess what? Developers are going to 5x their output, and you don't actually get access to the code, and you have to do everything through the browser and so forth. And so what I actually have, and I work with some people on, is a checklist of around like 20 to 25 things of like, if your QA team doesn't have access to the system under test code, that's a massive problem for these reasons. If your QA team is not allowed to add test IDs, because those literally take 10 seconds to do right now, or accessibility IDs, whatever you want to do with that, that's a problem. And to me, it's more about permissions and access than anything else when it comes to how you use AI as a QA team. And then the role is becoming more and more, are you comfortable with the code base? Are you comfortable with producing test automation, reviewing the unit tests, and so forth? And I'll say from personal experience, like 3-4 years ago, I never would have looked at a code base that was like a full stack app. I wouldn't have known where to start. It was frankly intimidating in many ways. Developers felt like gods that like understood this thing that I never could understand. And now my greatest asset as a QA person, by far, like 10x, is the code base. Because now when I need to write an API test, I don't go look at Swagger to figure out what required fields are there. I just ask the code, what are the required fields on the API? When I think about test coverage, I say, hey, what unit test coverage already exists over this method? So I efficiently create end-to-end test coverage. I'm not saying that developers should stop doing unit and integration tests. They absolutely should, but those should become assets for QA people and part of our strategy, and not just this thing that exists in a separate lane. And if there's one thing that'll get me yelled at by QA people, it tends to be that, which is like, it's like, I don't know why it doesn't come across, which is they are thinking that somehow I'm saying that developers shouldn't do unit tests, and I'm not at all. I'm saying developers should write perfect coverage. And in fact, my opinion is that developers should write API tests and end-to-end tests and everything, but they're not like oftentimes great at it. And so QA's job, like we've always done, is to do testing. And so we need to also think about the unit and integration test kind of coverage as part of that holistic experience.
Okay. And with all this volume of testing being produced, like how do you manage the PR, the reviews, and the validations?
Yeah, so in terms of that, there's a couple of things that I've done and I try to roll out. One is a concept called policy as code. So what that is basically this idea that you take a bunch of the things that you would catch in a PR review and you codify them into scriptable patterns. So for example, one of the things that a PR review might do is it might say, hey, I'm going to send this back because you're putting locators that are hard coded outside of constructors, right? That's a very common thing with a good junior engineer that they don't know. Well, the benefit now with AI is you can script very easily a bunch of these checks, which is like, hey, it'll flag this. And the benefit of that is that now you are creating deterministic rules around the AI that it can't violate. And so what we do is we have roughly 400 or 500 of these policies as code rules where before it ever gets to a PR, we've done an extensive validation of anything that the AI has produced meets our standards. Then when it comes to the actual sort of PR review, we're much more focused on intent of the test than we are focused on the individual lines of code. And once again, that is because we enforce these standards through this architecture scripting concept. So when it comes to looking through the intent, what we're primarily focused on is what are the assertions it's making, what's the level of depth that the test goes. And what we're trying to do is not just do a code review from a PR perspective. We're trying to look at, did the test that you created effectively cover the intent of what this test is? And we're trying to review it through that lens. So I would say that if you're trying to do traditional PR reviews, you're going to get completely buried by AI. I just don't see or understand how it's possible. So it's about adopting some of these newer practices that are now a bit more feasible because of the tools we have available to us.
Okay. And you also said earlier, QA is viewed as a bottleneck. Can you explain why and what we can do about that?
Yeah, I mean, mostly let's start from this. Most QA teams are under-resourced significantly, right? So you have this concept of in QA of oh, you have 1 QA to 5 devs or something like that, right? That's the most common ratio that I hear from a lot of organizations and how they do it. And then oftentimes the QA that they're hiring, they don't have the same budget for, what a dev would be. So they basically underpay and under-resource their QA departments, right? And then they say, great, now you need to do testing and checking. And what's fascinating about testing and checking is that it's oftentimes, to do well, extremely deeper than most organizations actually think. And then they wonder why they have death by 1,000 cuts, and it's because they're doing all the surface level stuff, right? As a bottleneck, right, same thing, you have a range, right? So if you are just doing manual testing and you're going to do a regression every single time, right? Well, that's going to be a bottleneck because a human has to go through and do all those tests, right? If you have more of a TDD style or BDD style, on the other hand, there is in theory no bottleneck because you just have all your continuous deployments and your testing, but there's a huge risk that the developer or whoever is not actually writing effective tests. So in the middle is this world that a lot of organizations have, which is a test automation team, right? So a developer is going to push, a test automation team is going to be writing test automation, and then you have, maybe a release or something like that with some exploratory tests. What's interesting about that as a general concept and why it becomes a bottleneck is the idea of low leverage activities versus high leverage activities. And what I mean by that is that a lot of QA teams are bottlenecked because they are trying to solve for the wrong constraint. So one of the most common things that will happen in the world of QA is bad locators, right? So a test automation engineer gets a test, they write that automation test, they then have it fail, right? And they're trying to update the locators or make them stable. And, the developer has done really, really bad probably practices when it comes to the front end code or something like that. And so the bottleneck is trying to get this automation test working, right? Well, traditionally speaking, right, we never would touch the front end code or anything like that. So we're just stuck doing this constraint, which is trying to write this automation test, right? The easiest way to fix that bottleneck is to not fix it at the automation level. It's just to use AI to go and add test IDs or accessibility IDs or whatever you want to do to the front end code. And then that bottleneck will go away because you no longer need to write these crazy locators. Another example of a bottleneck would be like flakiness, right? So one of the most common things by far when it comes to test automation and the time it takes that I see with organizations is people will write all these automated tests and they're just like, God, it's flaky, it's flaky, it's flaky. And the most common reason for flakiness is one of two things. It's going to be either some kind of like race condition at the front end where something is happening in the wrong order, the most common of which is like a button is showing as interactable before the API has come back and given it the data that it needs or something like that. Or the second most common form of flakiness is test data, right? And in both cases, automation engineers are bottlenecks because it's a tremendously challenging thing to deal with those. The low leverage activities are to add awaits or to add wait for requests or all of these different tools that have traditionally been available to us. The high leverage activity is just to fix the front end code's race condition, right? Like do not show the button is edible until the API call comes back. And what's fascinating about that is that traditionally, these problems only affected automation engineers, not real world humans very often, because it was so fast. Like Playwright is so fast that it only affects automation engineers. So the front end and the product people would not actually go ahead and fix this stuff because it wasn't worth it. Because they're like, well, none of our users care. And this is so tedious to do well because it is remarkably tedious to deal with all the loading order of operations and stuff like that. Well, now a lot of these problems are literally solved in 10 seconds if you just point AI at it. And so from a bottleneck perspective, I could spend 3 hours trying to like write all this Playwright stuff that's, my awaits, my loads, check these 5 things before I do this, or I can just go fix the race condition. And what's so funny about this, and I'll talk about this briefly before stopping, is this idea that QA is a bottleneck. I spent years dealing with flakiness in Playwright and just being like, is this framework flaky? But every framework is flaky. So why? Why? And then one of the things I've noticed over the last 3 years doing a lot of my own development on my side is Playwright isn't flaky in my development. And like one day it clicked where I was like, wait a second. It's because when I'm doing development and I have all of the source code and whatever, I don't try to add a bunch of weird stuff to Playwright. I just fix the code and then Playwright never flakes. But in all these other situations where I'm not allowed to touch the front end code, Playwright is beyond flaky because their code base is flaky, not Playwright. And so QA is a bottleneck because we're dealing with a poorly written product, right? And so a lot of that to say, like, there are ways from a process perspective that you can make QA and a permissions perspective, you can make QA a lot less of a bottleneck than just this idea of like, oh, well, we need more QA or we're under-resourced and stuff like that. So yeah, those are kind of a couple high-level thoughts.
Yeah, great. There's also an issue you mentioned earlier about the slow adoption. Like it seems like testers, they are not willing to try those new tools. And we saw in your experience, like in few years, you become kind of experts. Do you have any advice for testers that are scared to use those new tools? How they can get started?
Yeah. I guess at its core, what I would say is I have learned more using AI and just asking why over and over again than I've learned in the last 15 years. So like I used to look at Stack Overflow. It never made sense to me. I could never look at Stack Overflow and make the jump of like, oh, this kind of works the same way as mine, so I get it now. Didn't work. I can use ChatGPT though and go and say, well, what is this? Why is this? Why? Oh, this, and just cue in on words and just ask why over and over and over again. And we have the single most intellectually capable tutor that has ever been invented that traditionally you would have paid thousands of dollars an hour for to sit over your shoulder, and it's just available to you. So like as a learning tool, I think it's unbelievable. And I think that's where there's oftentimes a disconnect between QA people and software engineers, where software engineers in many cases recognize that the art of software and engineering as a whole is the art of learning, not memorization. So the act of constantly learning new frameworks, new things, new this. And software engineers are also like, oh yeah, I know Python, so I can learn Ruby, right? They recognize that they can learn quickly. A lot of QA engineers, because they didn't grow up wanting to get into like software engineering, I think don't necessarily have that mindset where they're seeking to learn as a default. They instead think, oh, I'm valuable because I can memorize all the Playwright stuff, right? And they're thinking about it more as like an end goal competency, as opposed to every day I'm going to wake up and learn. And so to me, what I try to talk to QA folks about is this idea of like, particularly in today's world, anything that you learn today is most likely not going to be relevant in a year. Like, and it's true, like all of the AI things that I was doing a year ago are like similar, I guess, but are largely completely different. But the act of training my brain to learn at this pace, to pick up on this stuff, to build the foundational knowledge, that's unbelievable valuable. And so it's this idea of like asking why as you're doing stuff, and not just thinking about like AI as a tool to be able to get the task done in like a third of the time. And so, yeah, it's kind of the core. What I would also add to it is I do really fundamentally believe that AI is going to affect two kind of positions pretty severely. One is going to be developers who don't care about testing are going to become a lot less valuable, because AI makes testing so easy to add automated tests in that a developer who understands how to effectively test their code is going to be so much more valuable to an organization than a developer who doesn't. On the other hand, what I would say is there is a risk in some ways of the QA engineer who truly does not want to get into AI and automation and some of these other things, I think becoming a little bit less valuable than they've traditionally been, because the act of automation is so much easier to do and so much better to do at scale that you just frankly don't need as much of the truly non-technical people. And so both of those spectrums are actually pushing towards this middle role, which is like engineers who can understand code and testing and product and sort of be what traditionally has been that like unicorn. Those are going to be the people who kind of win in this whole game. And then everyone else needs to sort of get on board with that as a vision or not. But once again, that is one human's opinion on this. So like, please do not take it for anything other than just like one person's opinion.
Okay, so now that we talk about the problem, let's talk about how to implement augmented coding in day-to-day. In one of your videos, you said prompting is not enough. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So when it comes to AI, there's kind of two core components to AI. There's prompting and there's context, right? Prompting is basically what you are typing in, and then context is what you're giving it. Context traditionally was a choke point in many ways for a lot of AI models. It has used to be like, it could absorb like 10,000 tokens of context, and then it was 200,000 of context. Now context is frankly a lot less of a choke point than it used to be. It can see up to 1 million tokens in many times. And so context as a problem, I used to talk a lot about like, in order to get the best from AI, you have to really think about context and what that means. And what context is basically giving it the sort of guardrails of where it should look, the folder it should look in, all of the different sort of the components of like scoping its direction, and then the prompt. The amended answer to that is, I think that what I would say is there's this sort of third component that has come to it. So context is a lot less important, but also people, I think, try to over prompt and like one shot stuff, when to me it's more the act of like driving towards a goal. So for example, when I'm coding, if I'm doing a page object model, I will start with a simple prompt as simple as like add a POM for this page, right? And there's a lot of people, when I watch them do it, they're like, I'm doing a Playwright suite. I need you to add a page object model and follow X, Y, or Z. And like they waste a bunch of time basically over explaining to AI in a way that AI is smart enough just to go see that you're doing Playwright, to see that you have other page object models, stuff like that. So to me, what I would say is I care less about like the perfect prompt and more about parallelization. So I run 4 to 6 Claude code instances at any given time, or Codex instances at any given time. So I'm never waiting for AI. If I am ever waiting for AI, that's a problem. So that is number one. And then number two is I don't worry about perfect prompts or perfect context. Instead, I just drive and I assume it's going to mess up the first few times, and so I'm constantly just pushing it. And so I think that it goes back to AI being a skill. There's a lot more things in AI than people just thinking, okay, I need to know the perfect prompt. And that's where it goes back to, there's so many YouTube videos that are just kind of garbage that are like, here's the perfect prompt to do this thing. And it's like, first off, it's never going to 100% do the thing because AI is not deterministic. And so there is no perfect prompt. And two, there's a lot of other things that are more important than that perfect prompt.
Yes, you mentioned also research, rollback, rules.
Exactly.
Those are
Yeah. It's
important.
like, there's all kinds of those tools, right? And the key too is to take basically non-deterministic tools like rules and stuff like that and pair them with deterministic things like scripts and test automation. And between those two, that's where you start to truly have like effective output.
Okay. And you also use AI to generate data, right? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the example being like data factories, right? So traditionally, data factories are a remarkably tedious thing. If you don't know what data factories are, data factory is the idea of generating test data from basically your schema and creating a factory around your schema. So let's imagine that you have a test and that test needs to edit an event, right? So a data factory is going to basically use the schema plus Faker or whatever other library you want to generate all the fake data that you would need for that event, right? And in the past, it was tedious to the point of almost unusable to try to turn schemas, particularly if they were like under development, into factories, was just not almost worth the time because there's so many data objects and interfaces and types and stuff like that. One of my favorite things now with AI is to basically create data factories that seed the data. It has cut down the size of suites tremendously because we're no longer having to use API tests or, frankly, in some cases, even having to use like the UX UI to seed all the data. And now we can just basically write data factories against the schema, seed the data, run the test, tear that data down. So it goes back to, and this is where AI is a skill, at a surface level, people are like, oh, let's use AI to write locators. Then you start to get into it and you're like, no, AI can actually affect the whole test infrastructure in a way that is unbelievably useful, and data factories being kind of one of those key things.
Okay. Another use case is test case generation. So is it something you're doing with Cursor as well?
Yeah, so and this is also an area that I think is sort of threatening to QA people in some ways. I think that AI is remarkably good at test case generation if it has all the context. And what I mean by that is basically if you give access, if you have all your repos locally, right, your backend repo, your front-end repo, any other repos that you're using, if you give AI access to the schema, if you give AI access to the databases itself, which is something that more and more the databases expose CLI tools where AI can literally query the database. AI is unbelievably good at thinking about test cases. And so one of the common things that I will do is I will say, here's a new feature, look through the code base, look through the schema, look through the database, come up with the first 50 test cases, right? And every QA engineer is going to say, yeah, they do all the obvious ones, which is like true, 100%. Then I'll say, come up with 50 test cases that are not obvious that you think are going to be like edge cases, right? And it comes up with fantastic edge cases. It really does. And so the sort of art of that as a human now becomes spotting gaps, right? So it's going to be, great, I'm going to generate 200 test cases, which frankly, like we would never have done those tests anyways. We would have done like 20 of those test cases because we have the constraints of human time and energy and attention and everything like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to now view my job as someone who needs to spot the gaps in what it's done and to do some sort of high-level exploratory testing at times to sort of look for those gaps, right? I have had plenty of times where it's passed the whole automation suite and then opened an app and been like, how did I miss that, right? But it's about combining those two things and not just writing it off, because frankly, if you are, you're going to fall so far behind so quickly that like it goes back to this idea of we now need to keep up with developers who are producing 5x the amount of stuff. The way you do that is with AI and doing these kind of approaches.
Okay. And is there any guardrails you put in place to make sure it doesn't create any issue or problem?
I probably don't do as many as some folks, right? So like the way I use AI right now is it has permission to commit, it has permission to pull, it has largely permission to do anything. I think that in larger organizations, there's a lot more guardrails, right? Where some of them that we work with, AI doesn't get access to the databases, for example. AI operates on its own like independent instance that's like oftentimes under-resourced. To me, guardrails are a balancing act between efficiencies and sort of risk management, right? So you see all the time on LinkedIn or these other platforms like, oh, AI deleted this whole prod database. Well, it's obvious, like, yeah, AI should never have been allowed to delete the whole prod database. Like that should have not been something that AI was ever like, allowed to do. Like and everyone thinks like that's an AI. They're like, well, I created a rule that said don't delete the prod database. It's like, okay, so you created a non-deterministic rule because all these rules are non-deterministic, and you gave it access to something that it should never have access to. Well, like, first off, just don't give AI access to the prod database, because what's the upside of that? Well, the upside of AI having access to the prod database only is maybe your ability to diagnose things from a support perspective. And even then, if it's going to have access, it certainly should not have read or write access. It should only have read access. And even that, like, if you want. So like that's not an AI problem, that's a human problem that someone just did something really, really dumb. In terms of other guardrails though, I think that frankly speaking, there is a selective fear over AI that is, to me, getting in the way of its usefulness, and then people don't understand why they're not having success with it, right? So let's imagine, for example, and this was very common a year ago, it's less common now, AI doesn't get access to the code base, right? Because this idea that like AI somehow is going to steal the whole code base. Well, why is that a selective fear? Well, you're putting your code base in GitHub. So like already third-party entities have access to your code base, and it's the same terms of use, largely speaking, between OpenAI and Anthropic. Like they have enterprise level terms of use saying, hey, we're not going to do your stuff, whatever. And if you don't believe those, you should not be putting your code base into GitHub, because GitHub has the same terms of use and they could easily be stealing all your stuff if that. So like as a selective fear, right? But the downside of that is significantly higher, because then you're saying, okay, developers use AI, but AI can't read the code base. So what? You're going to like use ChatGPT to try to help code. And then you wonder why you're reading on the internet all these people having so much success with AI when your company's not. And that plays out in a much more micro level, right? So AI can't do direct database queries against the staging database, right? Or logs, right? This is a very common one in the QA. It was like, oh, well, AI can't pull logs. Well, I'm significantly more efficient when I'm doing QA and automation and finding bugs, because when I'm running it, I just have AI go read the logs in the app. And it just says, oh, that was a 500 error, and here's the error, and I know where the bug is within 10 seconds. Whereas someone who's not allowed to use AI to read logs in the app because of whatever reason, permissions or access, they have no idea. They're now going to see that the test failed. They don't really know why the test failed. They're going to make a ticket that this test failed. Some developer is going to go look into it. They're going to try to go back into the logs and figure it out. And it's like, no, just have AI have access to the app logs and then just attach it all right there. So, I've kind of gotten off the point, I think, of guardrails. So I think that the danger is, I understand why you're putting the guardrails in place and what the trade-off is, because oftentimes, in my opinion, the reason why you're doing it is not justifiable when you're already using other tools that probably have the same access, and the trade-off is significantly worse than you would expect it to be.
Okay, so we are close to the end. So let's talk about the last section. Do you have any advice for beginners who are looking to get into testing or QA field?
Yeah. So there's this fear that I see all the time is that like AI is going to kill the role of the junior engineer. And I think that's a really interesting conversation, because I think that, to me, I don't really see that happening. I think what it's going to do is it's going to kill the role of the sort of not ambitious junior engineer who was comfortable just kind of like sitting and not learning for 5 to 8 years. What I really think AI is going to do is it's going to shorten the time span that someone is considered junior. And what I mean by that is, for a certain group of humans who are extremely ambitious, want to learn, want to grab onto this, they are going to be considered junior for a significantly less time period because of how quickly they can learn. Whereas I think that what role it is eliminating in some ways is the idea of like You just needed extra hands. And there's a lot of developers who are like, well, coding was never the hard part. It was never the hard part. That's just not true, because there's a reason why you had 40 engineers and a bunch of junior ones doing the work. Literally, the act of typing took a long time to do a lot of this stuff. It was literally the hard part. And so, yes, now it is true that like that is no longer a choke point. So if I'm just getting into this industry, what I'm focused on is not like, okay, wait a second, they're eliminating all these like junior roles or whatever. What I'm focused on is, how do I learn these skills that I need to be whatever this new version of a senior engineer is? And that's a lot of architecture skills. It's a lot of sort of like overall skills, stuff like that. Now, there's a lot of people who are going to say, well, wait a second, well, how do you get that experience? How do you do it? And my answer to that is, I think that right now, there is more you can learn pulling open source GitHub projects and basically being able to use AI to figure out like, here's a whole test suite for it and all these other things than you could ever do. And this goes back to also just the desire to learn and frankly do stuff maybe you're not going to get paid for. If I'm hiring someone, right, and they're out of, getting into QA, and they're saying to me, hey, I've pulled down these 3 open source projects and built out entire automation suites for them, and here's my work and blah, blah, blah. I'm frankly considering them for much higher positions that I need than sort of what traditionally has been the case, which is this idea of like, you join an organization as someone getting into something, you kind of learn the junior sets of skills as you're doing it, and so forth. And so I think that to summarize as advice or thoughts, the way to approach getting into engineering and QA is fundamentally changing. And if you, I think, are looking for your traditional sort of junior entry point jobs, those are going to be probably moving in the wrong direction comparatively to this. Now, on the other hand, there's a concept called the Jevons paradox or something like that, which is an economic concept, which basically says that the cheaper something is to produce, the more there will be of it. And so there's a lot of people who are arguing that like, while you're going to see this constriction of software jobs in the short term because of AI, as more companies realize that they can produce software, you're going to see an explosion of opportunities. Like there's a brewery a couple miles from me that is building their own custom CRM system because they can, and it's completely, or ERP system, not CRM, building their own ERP system because they can. They have a couple developers on staff. They're able to do a ton. You're going to see that times like a million, where everyone's just going to start building their own stuff for themselves. And so I think there's going to be more opportunities than ever before for the people who want it. So yeah, those are high level thoughts.
Okay, and we're close to the end. Can you talk also about your YouTube channels and what you're doing for agentic or for testers?
Yeah, so I have 2 YouTube channels. I've got one called benfellows-QA and one benfellows-dev, I want to say. The QA ones focus primarily on combination of Playwright, agentic QA, and then some sort of high-level thought leadership components in terms of like org structure, stuff like that. The development one is mostly focused on like agentic pipelines and agentic development and trying to talk about that journey. I do a lot on LinkedIn if you want to follow me there. And then a couple of things I do have coming up. So we're doing a lot more workshops these days. Most of our workshops are unfortunately for directors and managers thinking about strategy. We are in the process of possibly working on some sort of more self-learning tools where people can kind of sign up and take some of these things, some of the concepts that we're working on of like policy as code and some of the other things that I think that we're doing a bit more unique on. I'm trying to look at packaging those as opportunities for people to kind of self-learn. But yeah, we try to do videos a couple times a week on both channels. So far the feedback has been really great and would love to have you check it out and subscribe to them.
Yeah, thank you. And that was my last question. Any other question I did not ask you would like to answer?
I think the last thing that I would say is just speaking from a personal journey. 8 years ago, I knew very little about QA. 3 years ago, I knew almost nothing about like full stack development in terms of like how to do it myself. I knew every term. We live in an age where we can learn and like dream and do stuff so fast. And I have learned more in the last year than I ever possibly could have learned in the last 15 years. And I just hope that's like sets in for people, because it's been so much fun. Like it's so much fun. Like I 2 nights ago was deploying an app into AWS and like trying to like understand it and learn. I never would have learned it, but I just set up an AWS CLI and I was able to engage, and I was like, okay, so what is this or what is that? And like, is this the proper sizing and resourcing? And there's probably people who are like, oh, you don't know AWS, you shouldn't be doing that. It's like, I learned a ton and it cost me like nothing to do. And it was a lot of fun. And so I think that, like, to me, if you can break through the fear of change and some of the other things that are kind of, I think, permeating in many ways, this moment in time we live in is just so much fun. There's so much opportunity to learn, so much opportunity to do. And that would be kind of the final thought I'd leave people with.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's been a valuable conversation. Thanks again for taking the time to share your experience and insights. I will link all the resources for those interested, your LinkedIn profile and your YouTube channels and your company website. Anything else, let me know.
Yeah, it was great to be with you.
Thank you. So that concludes today's episode of How to Test This. I hope you found it valuable. If you did, please share with your colleagues and stay tuned for upcoming episodes. So this is Mamadou, and thank you, Ben, once again, and see you next time. Bye.